The first thing we're going to take a look at is our mapping modes within View. And I just have our default scene loaded in right now. And what I'm going to do is just load in a couple of objects. And I have just our sphere. And I'm also going to load in a cylinder and make sure we move that off to the side. And I'm also going to load in a box and just a cube. Zoom out a little so we can see the scene a little bit better. And I also want to set up our render options for this, just so we can really take a look at the materials once we've created them. So I'm going to go up to the upper right and right mouse click on our camera to bring up our render options. I'm going to set this to Final, Render to Screen so that we're not rendering within the viewport. And I'm going to select 800 by 600 for our pixel size, which should give us a pretty good decent render size. We'll be able to see entirely what's going on. And the default atmosphere should be good enough to render quickly, because we're really only focusing on our materials and not so much the actual scene itself. So I'm going to change our lighting model in the atmosphere editor. Just go up to Atmosphere, Atmosphere Editor, or you can hit F4. And I'm going to change our light model to Standard, because we really don't need global ambience on, because we mostly want just a quick render to show us what these materials are going to look like. And I'm going to start out with our cylinder. So we just want to select that in our layers, or you can just directly click on that in the screen to select it. And we still have our default surface on, which we can see in the upper right. And I'm going to double click on that, which is going to pull up our material editor. Now if you're in the basic material editor, which will look like this, you want to make sure you go up to the top and select our advanced material editor. All those our mapping options, which is what we're going to be looking at, are located in both the advanced and the basic material editor. But because we're going to be using some image maps for this, we're going to need to use the advanced material editor. So now if we take a look under our mapping mode, under the effects, let me go ahead and expand that. We can see we have 8 different options. 4 of them are world options, and the other 4 are object. And these are our major mapping modes, whether or not we're working in object mode or world mode. And this has to do with our units and the way we affect our objects based on material. So let's start out by switching this to an object standard. And I'm going to change our material on our surface so that we can see a little bit better of what's actually going on. So I'm going to change this to a mapped picture, and then just load in what I already have in my browser. And this is the checker weave JPEG image. You click OK, and that is located in the content folder on the CD-ROM. Now, because we are using an image map for this, we need to rely on a separate set of options for our mapping modes, where we have automatic, flat vertical, faces, cylindrical, spherical, and torical. And one thing to keep in mind is that image maps are going to be a separate mapping mode than what we have in our mapping up at the top. So typically when you're working with just a texture, basically what we have, where we have it as image-based, some of these settings aren't really going to apply, and they're going to give us some undesired results in some cases. So typically you want to work with either an object standard, object parametric, or world standard, world parametric, but it really depends. And let's take a look at those options right now and why that can depend. So we'll start out with just the object standard mode. I'm going to click OK, and now we can see in our preview render how this material looks. So let's go ahead and just render that, and we can take a look. We can notice a couple of problems with this, but it really depends on how it is you're mapping your image. The main thing we can notice is the stretching that we have along the edges of our cylinder. And let's go ahead and just close this out. We're going to go back into the material editor, and let's take a look at the settings that we have. Our mapping mode is set to automatic, which is going to select one of the following based on the shape of the object. And it's going to be either a cylinder or a spherical, which is used for our automatic mapping mode. So if we change this to cylinder and we take a look and we let that refresh, we're going to see that looks pretty much exactly the same. So that's more than likely the automatic mapping mode was selecting our cylindrical mode, and that's because our object is a cylinder. If we change this to spherical, we can see that changes a little bit more. And now we are using the spherical mapping mode. And we can tell it looks a lot different on the top and along the bottom of the object. So let's go ahead and render that. Now, because we're in spherical mode, we're mapping more to the top of the object. As with cylindrical mode, we're mapping more around the object, as we would if we were working mainly on the outside of our cylinder. But we also have this nice spherical mode on top, which is giving us a little bit of our texture and showing a lot more of that image within there. So in this case, it might be a good idea to have another object in the shape of a cylinder with a spherical mapping mode in order to get this sort of design without all the stretching, and that way we have a little bit more of the actual material showing up in there. I'm also going to adjust the size a little now, just so we can see a little bit more of our surface. And the way we can do that is just by adjusting our image scale. So I'm going to change this to 0.5 on our X and our Y, and we'll let that update. And now we can see a lot more of the material and more of the texture within our object. So we'll go ahead and render that, and you can take a look. So we can see that we have basically the same effect, but now we're seeing more of that material, and that's just because we've changed its size. And a lot of what happens after we reach that initial size has to do with some of our other modes. If we close this out, we can take a look at tiling, and we can see we have a couple of different options. We can repeat, we can mirror, or we can just show it once. And basically, this is asking us, what would we like to do after we reach this image scale? So we have at 0.5 the entire image being portrayed in 0.5 units, which is actually about meters in here. And we can select whether or not we'd like to repeat and continue our surface, which we would do with seamless textures, or we could also mirror it. Now, because of the type of material I'm using right now, mirroring it is actually going to give us the exact same effect. But if we had a material that was not completely symmetrical and something that was not going to look exactly the same, then we would notice we would get a mirroring seam, and we would have the exact opposite on each side. So it really depends on what it is that you're working with and the kind of effect that you want to get out of it. And I'm just going to switch this over to Faces mode now, so we can take a look at this option. And we want to zoom in to our cylinder. And we can already see in the OpenGL view some of the problems that will arise for using Faces modes on objects that it's really not compatible with. So let's go ahead and just render this and take a look. And because Faces mode is mapping on direct axes, on the Z, and the X, and the Y, we can see that sometimes our materials will not line up. And we can see in this case, our texture, we have this line going through where we have these very small white blocks, and around it, everything looks correct. So that's really not a mode you want to be using for an object like this if you have seamless textures or something that you want to really line up, and you're going to end up getting this seam. Now, in this case, because of the way this material blends, this actually doesn't look like it's really creating a seam. But if we had an image map where it's not going to match up this well, then we're going to see a very obvious seam down the center, and even this is fairly obvious. And now we're just going to turn this back to our cylindrical mode and take a look. Now, if we actually wanted to map this surface, it's going to end up being entirely seamless. It's going to look really good because we're in the cylindrical mapping mode. But we do have to make a few compensations for image size to get it to look correct. So we can do that right now by adjusting our X scale under image scale. You can bring that down to 0.2, take a look, and let that refresh. And now we can see they're still a little stretched out, so we might want to bring that down a little bit more. We can take a look at 0.1, see how that looks. And now we have pretty even squares. If we need to, we can bring it down a little further, but this should show up quite well. So let's go ahead and render that. And we can see everything is really nice and uniform, and it's going to look this way around the entire surface, because basically what it's doing is matching up our seams at the ends. And if you have a seamless texture map, then there won't be any problems at all. You won't notice any seams, and we'll get a nice even distribution throughout the round part of our surface. Although on the top is going to look a little bit different. We can go ahead and render that and take a look at it. And it's going to show up a lot differently on our top because of the way the image is shaped, or the model is shaped. And mainly with our cylindrical mapping, we want to be focusing on the cylindrical part of our surface. So with a material like this, what we would actually want to do if we were going to use the same surface is we could just make another cylinder on the top and have that as a separate material. And then we'll be able to use either flat vertical, or we can use cubic, or we can, or not cubic, sorry, faces, which is very similar to cubic modes in some other programs. And then we can also use that spherical, which will show up. So let's take a look on some of the other objects now, and how these different mapping modes relate. And then we're going to move on to the world mapping, and how that differs from our standard mapping modes, along with the parametric settings. I'm going to delete our cylinder from the scene, so that we just have our sphere and cube. And I'm going to just move our cube over so we don't have that direct shadow on it. We can zoom in and take a look. Going to double click on our sphere in the material, making sure it's selected. And we're just going to go through the same thing we did before. I'm going to change this to Object Standard, Mapped Picture, and we're just going to load in that checker weave. Change our image scale to 0.5 on both axes so that it's showing up a little more correctly. Now currently our mapping mode is set to automatic, so it's basically going to set us to a spherical mapping mode. If I change this to spherical and we take a look, we can tell that looks exactly the same. And if we were working with procedurals, then these above mapping modes basically translate over between our spherical and cylindrical. But with image maps, we do have some extra settings. Go ahead and zoom in. And I just want to change this to our cylindrical mode. And we can take a look, and we can see how that changes. Now we see more of our material towards the outer edges, just as we did while working with the actual cylinder. And then up on the top, we're not seeing as much definition. If I switch back, we take a look at the spherical, now we can see all those extra options coming in. So it's really a matter of the object space and how much surface we're mapping to, and in relation to specific sizes. So in this case, if I need to have more definition around the edges of our sphere, which we can tell it looks like we're going to need some, we can bring the x-axis down to 0.2. If we re-render that, take a look, now we can see we have a lot more of that image going around the surface, and of course up at the top too. But we still have a bit of stretching on our y-axis, so what we can do is alter that as well. We can bring that down to a 0.3, let that render, and we still see a little stretching, so maybe 0.4, let that render out, and now we have a fairly even surface. And we can take a look at that. Let's go ahead and just render it. And we can tell that our surface is appearing correctly. And like I said, because we have the spherical on, we have that nice amount of definition on the top, along with around the sides. If I was to change this to our faces mode, we're going to notice a little bit of a change. Because this way, we're not really connecting the seams of our materials. We're projecting them independently from each of our axes. So let's go ahead and render that, and we'll take a look. And now we can see the results of that showing up with these very large image seams, and the way it kind of curves and distorts around the edges of our surface. And that's because this isn't the best option for this specific type of material, or this type of object. I'm just going to close this out. We're going to click OK. And I'm just going to delete our sphere from the scene now. We're going to move on to the cube we have created. We can select that, go into our Advanced Material Editor, change our Map Picture Mode, load in our checker weave. I'm going to change our image scale to 0.5 on the X and the Y. And now our automatic mapping mode is automatically going to a faces mode. So if I change that to faces, we can look at it directly. And we can see there's no change. Now this works quite well for our cube-based objects because when we hit the seam on the end, we're really not going to notice it because they start to match up. So let's go ahead and render that. And now if we take a look, we can see it's matching up quite well around the edges. And this is definitely the mapping mode you'll be wanting to use if you're going to be using cube-based objects. If I change this to flat vertical, we're going to notice something a little bit different. Flat vertical, the way this works, is more when you're working with material maps on sort of a terrain, or if you want to have that stretching on the sides. I'm going to render this and we can take a look. And this is very similar to our faces mode, but in the respect that we're only using one axis to project on, and that is the up and down axis. So we can see our material showing up correctly on the top of the surface, but on the rest of it we're just stretching those pixels that are on the edges, and we're going to get this striped mode. Close that out. If we take a look at the cylindrical mode on this, it's going to work the same way as it did with our cylinder, and if we want, we can adjust our image scale so that everything lines up on our seams, and bring that down to a 0.1, and now everything is going to be fully connected around the outer edges of this object. So even if our materials are not matching up on the seam or on the direct corner, they're still in the correct position and they will blend correctly with our image that we have loaded in. But on the top, we're going to notice that same sort of an effect. And same thing if I was to switch this to the spherical mode. So let's take a quick look now at the difference between world and object. I'm going to reset this back to a 0.5 for our image scale and set this back to faces, which would be the correct mapping mode for this type of object. And now currently this is set to parametric. If we change this to standard, we're not going to notice too much of a change. But let's swap this over to world standard and click OK. And we will be able to see this in the actual viewport. So what I'm going to do is change this to our scale mode, and I'm just going to start sizing up our object. And what we're going to notice is that the material stays in the exact same size, but our object is just moving through the material. And that's because with a world mode, we're not directly related to this object. We're in a world space. So as we move this object, we are moving it through our surface, and we're not actually manipulating the surface to go with any of the size changes that we are making. So I can move this up, and now we're moving upward through our material. So any sizes are not dependent on the actual size of the object, just on the size of the material itself. If we go back into the Advanced Material Editor, change this to an object standard, and click OK. Now let's take a look. Once we start sizing our object, we can see that the material is sizing with it. And instead of moving through our surface, it is completely connected to our object. So no modifications that we make are going to alter the way this surface appears. And this is very important when it comes to our rotation. So I'm going to double click, and we're going to change this back to world standard and click OK. And let's take a look at the rotation options. If I start to rotate our object, we can see our material still staying in the same place. So we have it basically uneven and maybe not the way we actually want this surface to appear. we still have this completely horizontal surface even though our material or object has been rotated. So I'm going to undo that, go back. If we change this to standard mode, object standard, and now we rotate, we can see the object and the material are rotating together. So let's undo that. And we're going to take a look at the parametric modes now. Go into our advanced material editor. We are on Object Standard. We're going to change this to Object Parametric. And click OK. And now if we pay close attention to our surface in this mode, I'm going to go ahead and scale this up. Just select our line, and we can scale this. And we can see our material stretching with it. And bring that down, we still see the same material over the same amount of space no matter how we manipulate this. If we change this to World Parametric and click OK and stretch it, we're going to notice the same sort of an effect. And we're no longer moving within that space within the World Parametric mode. We have a slight link where we can stretch out our object and actually manipulate the material. If we change that back to World Standard and click OK, and now stretch this, we'll see we're just expanding our material rather than stretching it. And now we can see we have a very small amount where it's repeated several times, but that's more of a display error. Zoom in a little. You can look at that scale and just see how we're moving through our surface. And we'll switch this to Object Standard. Click OK. And as we stretch it, we're going to see it stretching our material. But in the actual render, we can see it staying in the same place. So if we go ahead and render that, we can see this works in the standard mode where it's just expanding our overall surface and implying more because there's more surface area. But in the parametric mode, we're going to get what we see in our preview, which is a large amount of stretching in direct relation to how we are scaling our object. Although the actual scale of the material is still directly connected to the scale of our object and the scale of our material. So as I scale this up overall, we're still going to notice the exact same size. But in the parametric mode, we stretch it if we change the overall shape of our object rather than its initial size. So as we're stretching specific areas, we'll get a bit of stretching, but if we scale the overall object, the material is going to stay in the same place. And there's one more option to really show how that works a little bit better. If we switch this to World Parametric mode and then scale up, we can see the actual material itself is also moving in relation to the way we scale our object. And that's because the origin points are set up a lot differently when we're using parametric mode rather than the standard mode. And we can see how the surface moves more to the right as we are scaling it. And as we scale it down, we can see that slowly moving inward. And we just have our origin of our material changing along with the way we size it. Of course, when we still stretch it, we have the surface stretching out, but still the surface is moving within that slightly. So it's definitely something to pay attention to. And we'll see these mapping modes a little bit better in other chapters of the tutorial, where we're actually texturing specific objects in order to fit in with exactly which mapping mode we really need.